What's up, everybody? Rob here. So this is the American Civil War Part 2 from Oversimplified. If you haven't seen Part 1, please check it out. It is in the description. And if you haven't subscribed to Oversimplified, please do so. It's a small channel. You got to help them out. I'm trying to, help them out in any way that I can. Guys, right? They're the ones that need the help. Yeah. Any case, I have had in the previous video, I did have some issues with the audio. My voice was too soft and it was too loud, too soft compared to the video that was playing, and so there were some issues there. I don't think I corrected the issue so much as mitigated it because I am a boomer, and boomer is a state of mind and not an age. I am technically a millennial. Biologically, I'm a millennial. Mentally, I am a boomer. I'm odd. Any case, you should know that. If you're familiar with me at all, you should know that I'm weird. Any case, I think I have the issue at least somewhat dealt with. If not, I'm sorry. Any case, so I am going to be nerding out with this video a lot more because the war is in full swing and I'm a military history guy, and the Civil War is one of my favorite subjects to learn about. I actually, if you have been watching my channel at all, I've been focusing on things like early modern warfare, stuff like that. I actually know the Civil War way better than I know any of that stuff. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to be geeking out like you wouldn't believe on this, so be prepared for long, rambling rambles. And it's also early in the morning, though, so I might ramble, even though I shouldn't ramble because my thoughts aren't completely coherent, but that's also to be expected from me. Let's see, what else is there to say? Yeah, and I will be stopping along the way giving my commentary. Otherwise, you're just going to be looking at me looking at a screen, which is kind of weird for you guys. Look, whatever makes you happy, I don't judge, but that is still kind of weird. So, any case, Oversimplified, the American Civil War, Part 2, here we go.
This video was made possible by Honey. Stick around to learn how you can save money when you shop online.
Part 2.
As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg.
Okay, really the situation at this point, they were talking about Kentucky. Kentucky was a border state that was hotly contested. It never fully went over to the Confederate side. However, it was hotly contested territory. The population there was somewhere in between. It was a slave-holding state, but at the same time, though, it never joined the Confederacy. Yet there was a large percentage of the population that actually did. So it was pretty chaotic, pretty bloody over there. Now, as far as the Indian Territory goes. What is now Oklahoma was at the time Indian Territory, and a lot of tribes were sent over there, particularly the Cherokee with the Trail of Tears under Jackson and all that, and many other tribes. I don't know about the Seminoles. I'm not sure exactly which tribes were exactly sent there. It's early in the morning, people. Any case, they really had to choose between the lesser of two evils. Okay, basically, it wasn't so much like they have ideologically or one side or the other. They basically had to think, which side is going to screw me over the least? And a lot of them actually joined the Confederacy mostly because they felt that. They felt that the Confederates were going to, look, we've already gotten pretty bad treatment from the American government. Let's join up with the Confederates because they might actually appreciate us. If we fight on their side, they might actually, leave us alone or, not screw us over as badly. And now we got Grant and Sherman. More on Sherman. Sherman was interesting character in his own right, but Grant and Sherman, who basically they're the Union equivalent of the Lee-Jackson combo, and they are going down the Mississippi. He who controls the Mississippi controls the economy of the nation, and basically it's the main artery for the South, well, all the country as a whole, but particularly for the South because of their main ports along the way. And their basic strategy was, we have more numbers than the Confederacy. We're going to smash them until they break. We're not these guys, not to be insulting or anything like that, but tactical acumen was not really their thing. It was more like, we outnumber them straight down the middle, smash them to pieces, just blunt force trauma in, that sort of sense. All right, let's keep going.
Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. Alright, Mr. President. Option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general. Option 2. His qualifications are his name is Burnside, and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south.
Burnside is arguably one of the worst commanders in American history. He's just... the guy's terrible.
Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and
Okay, Fredericksburg was a complete disaster for the Union without going... Well, we'll see what they said, then I'll add on to it.
take the city. But the Union War Department was...
There's going to be a lot of spoilers coming up. It's 100... The event happened like 170 years ago. I don't know if it counts as spoilers anymore.
Too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey, Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, Rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey, God, whose side are you on? Ow. Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces.
Okay, they didn't really go into this, but actually the Union arrived in the area beforehand, and there was I believe it was Hancock, one of the Union Corps commanders, said, "Okay, look, I can get troops on the other side of the hill. There's the city on the other side of this river, and there's heights beyond that, and these things are perfect defensive positions, and we know the Confederate armies in the region. Let me get my corps across. We'll dig into those heights." And then we can hold those heights against the Confederacy until we can move the rest of our army across. And Burnside just flat out said, no, it's too dangerous. You'll be cut off. There's no possible, it's just, he just didn't see the value in doing so. And so Hancock basically had to practically beg, can I get my troops to the other side, hold this hilltop, at least hold off the Confederacy until you guys show up. We can, it's a perfect defensive position. And Burnside just flat out refused to allow him to do so. The Confederates moved in, and guess who, as you see right here, guess who managed to set up pretty significant barricades. And then once they set up those, that stone, there was a series of defenses there, stone walls, wooden barricades, the whole deal. Burnside's plan was, and you don't even have to be a military history guy, a military enthusiast to understand this, but basically their plan was to go uphill, and it was a pretty steep hill. It's like a 20-30 degree hill, uphill against fixed defenses with an entrenched enemy. It's and there's no cover. Yeah, there's trees and stuff in the area, yes, but it's not this dense cover. It's not like they're doing guerrilla warfare. We're talking up basically this bare slope with some sporadic trees here and there, but not enough for any real cover against a fixed position. It's do you know how badly this is going to work for you? So yeah, Burnside is just, and his response was, yeah, just keep going. It's no.
During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught. Even the Confederates couldn't believe what they were seeing, and in one moment of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet.
Lincoln was never actually particularly popular. He was just, I think his own cabinet members said that he was completely unqualified for the office, and he honestly shouldn't have been there. So to say that Lincoln's popularity was waning is kind of an understatement. It was never that much high to begin with.
Especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey!
Yeah, as far as the food was concerned, most of the Union Army rations, and Confederates armies too, the Confederates basically got whatever they could scrounge. They were always perpetually undersupplied. But the Union had something known as hardtack, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a chunk of bread, about yay big. And it would be dried out, it would be double baked. So basically, it's you got a giant cracker, basically a giant crouton, really. And it would last, theoretically, could last for months, indefinitely, which is fine if you're on long marches and stuff like that. You could, pack up tons of this stuff and you can supply your army. The problem, though, is that they would oftentimes be infested with weevils. And yes, I know, yeah, there's a pun here about Lesser of Two Weevils, and yeah, great movie. Any case, it would be filled with worms. Yeah, these little, their weevils are like little beetles, and then they'd be their larvae would be these little worms that would be in there, little maggots. And the only way you can deal with them is to, first off, you had to dip this hardtack in water, because otherwise, if you try to just chew it, directly, you'd probably break your teeth. And yeah, I mean, this stuff was like rock solid. Like, you had to break it apart, dip it in coffee or water to loosen it up. All these worms would come out. But after a while, a lot of troops actually just stopped doing that. They said, you know what, that's our meat ration, because like picking out all these weevils and stuff just became too much of a pain in the neck. So they just didn't even bother to do so anymore. So yeah, food was pretty terrible. But at least they had food. Confederates were more often than not starving to death. So maggot-infested bread or nothing.
Where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my. Here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence. Or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out.
Yeah, the draft riots you're talking about here. If you could actually get out of the draft if you paid $300, which in today's, I don't know what it is in today's terms, but it's like, we're talking like tens of thousands of dollars. And basically nobody had that money unless you were part of the upper classes. The lower classes simply could not afford it. And New York City, there was a massive series of riots. It was featured in Gangs of New York. It didn't really happen that way, but it was also a reasonably good movie. Not my favorite, but pretty good. Any case, yeah, there was a big riot over there over this because they called it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, because you have all these rich guys just seemingly able to get, just like, they pay off the $300, and then we're the ones that have to get shot. So yeah, it also led to Lincoln not being particularly popular.
In New York City, with enraged mobs, furious at the idea of going to fight for slaves. An idea that
likewise in the South, though, they actually, in a very similar sort of thing, you didn't have to necessarily pay to get out of military service, but actually, if you were a slave owner who held, I think it was more than 20 slaves, you were exempted from military service on account of you need to be there to prevent the slave uprising. So likewise in the South, they also had this similar issue of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist. And these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well, that last guy was...
Yeah, that was about the 54th. They didn't really go into it because it is important as far as history goes, but as far as the grand scheme of things, it was actually pretty minor. The 54th Massachusetts was used. It was an all-black regiment raised in Massachusetts. It was under white officers, though, but they were basically an experiment. Like, okay, can black people fight? Do they have the ability to do so? And this is a very racist time, so this question obviously has been answered. But the question became, can these people do that? And they were sent against Fort Wagner, and Fort Wagner was virtually an impenetrable fortress. And basically, they were sent like straight at. They bombarded for like I think about a day or two beforehand, and it was constructed in such a way that basically all their shots just did virtually zero damage to the fortress. And so the Confederates were ready and waiting when the 54th showed up, along with, I think there was a New York regiment as well. I could be mistaken. They had other supporting white units. Any case, the 54th went right in, and they got butchered. They got butchered along with the rest of them pretty badly. And yeah, it was just complete on a from a pure military standpoint, it was a complete and unmitigated disaster. However, they didn't run. The 54th stood, they fought, they held their ground. They got shredded by they got torn up by the meat grinder, but they did not retreat. And actually, this was seen as a massive, I guess you could say propaganda. Propaganda is a little too cynical, but it did have a great morale boost, surprising enough. It's like, yes, black people can and will stand and fight if the situation calls for it. So yeah, it actually helped encourage the use of black soldiers and like basically justify their use, because at this point it was seen as pretty much can we arm and equip black soldiers? Yes, you can. They will stand and fight, and they will act completely. They will act bravely and with incredible amounts of valor. So yes, again, a small footnote in the war as a larger part, but it is a very interesting subject and very important for that regard. Okay, I'm rambling.
Useless. Let's
Burnside, useless.
try this Hooker fellow. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again, Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle.
Yeah, this particular battle I'm not too familiar with, but basically, Lee, through a combination of maneuvering and confusion and diversions, managed to just completely outmaneuvered Hooker. His big thing here, though, is that Stonewall Jackson, his right hand, would be killed during this battle. Actually, he wouldn't be killed during the battle. He'd be killed after the battle while on scouting. I'm sure they're going to go over that.
Battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire. You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it.
Jackson was shot in the arm. He actually went out to scout the Union line, saw the where the Union were, rode back, and his men. It was dim. It was like right around dusk at that point, and the Confederate sentries did not ask. They just saw this guy riding towards him, and they just lit him up. He was wounded in the arm. His arm had to be amputated, and that was actually buried separately. And actually, I think his grave is still around. You can actually see Stonewall Jackson's arm. Well, not his arm. You can see the grave of his arm. And he then died, 8 days later from infection and, the trauma of being shot repeatedly. Well, he was only shot once, but still. This would actually be major for the Confederacy because Lee and Jackson together, they worked very well together. Their styles played off very well against each other. Jackson would be replaced. Lee's second in command would be James Longstreet, who was a much more cautious general, a very competent, very capable individual, but at the same time, though, he wasn't Jackson. And he and Lee, they got along, but they didn't have that same dynamism together. Like they didn't work as well together.
It was yet another loss, and Northern support continued to waver.
Let's see.
People are not asking the right questions. They're not asking the right questions because they kind of think they already know the answers.
I got
technology.
Yeah, I don't care anymore.
While the Union kept on struggling in the East, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking this.
Okay, yeah, the thing about this is going to be Grant's biggest victory. It's once he takes Vicksburg and, after, basically just defeating all the Confederate forces in the area, Lincoln is going to basically say, yeah, I want this guy running the Army of the Potomac. I want this guy in charge of everything. Send him in. Like, this is the final push that's going to say, like, yeah, this is the guy we want.
City, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything.
Okay, as far as West Virginia goes, Virginia as a whole wasn't really that big into secession, as far as states that seceded go from. For example, South Carolina was the first one. They were all for. Alabama, Mississippi, they were all for secession. Virginia was like, I don't know, maybe not. They were kind of like lukewarm on the issue. The reason why the Confederate capital is actually in Virginia, it's in Richmond, is because that was a concession to get Virginia on the Confederate side. Obviously, the Union capital in Washington D.C. They're not moving the capital. It's been there for forever, so it has to stay there. Why would you put your capital right next to Union territory? They're a short distance away from one another. The reason why is they wanted to encourage the Virginians to join them. However, the western part of Virginia, now West Virginia, these people there didn't really have slaves. This is very poor. It's a very impoverished area, much like today. It's, relatively speaking. And the people there didn't own slaves, or not nearly as much. They didn't really care at all. They almost considered themselves to be a separate entity to begin with. And it's like, wait, we're fighting to these, like, the rich plantations, far to the east. No, I'm not fighting for these guys. So they never really wanted, it was lukewarm to begin with. And then you had this big section that really didn't want to leave the Union. It's like, screw you. We're leaving. We're seceding from you. What now? Yeah.
In the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the
Gettysburg.
Because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling. Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got. And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania.
Okay, I'm going to nerd out here a lot when we're talking about Gettysburg, because I know Gettysburg probably better than any other single battle, so just brace yourselves for some high-impact ramblings. Okay.
Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st,
Okay, the idea here was Lee was absolutely right here in that the Confederates needed to win a victory. The longer the war lasted, the better it was for the Union. They could always replace losses. Immigrants were coming over, especially from Ireland and other places as well, but especially Ireland. They were pouring in, and they were oftentimes just being shipped right off to the front lines from there. They could replace these losses. They had a larger population to begin with. Their economy was stronger, and the Confederates had to deal with the Union blockade, which was cutting off any sort of resupply that they had. So the longer it lasted, the worse things were for Confederacy. And Lee wanted to win this massive victory. Now, the morale in the North, as you saw here, as you saw earlier, was collapsing. People weren't particularly happy with this war. They didn't want to keep doing it. So if you thought, look, if I can win this massive victory on Northern soil and then threaten, I don't even have to capture Washington, D.C. I can just threaten Washington, D.C. They'll sue for peace. So it was a very big gamble. However, it hopefully would pay off for the Confederacy. It didn't because, spoiler alert, it didn't work out so well. And, Lee wanted this big victory, mostly for the propaganda purposes. Like, let's take the fight to them and show them that, look, I can walk into Pennsylvania. There's nothing you can do about it. And when you send an army after me, I'll just shatter them too. The problem here, though, is, a bit of overconfidence on Lee's part and the fact that Jackson had been killed at this point, meaning that that dynamism between the two of them wasn't there anymore. And he again had to rely on Longstreet, who competent commander, but just didn't share the same vision as him, and I'll get into that when it comes up a little more about him.
From each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "I'm not gonna let them take my beans." "How many times do I have to tell you, they're not here for your beans?" By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left. But
Okay, I was actually at Gettysburg a couple years ago, and I was actually at both these places. This is right here. This is Little Round Top, and there's going to be a major fight there. Famously, the 20th Maine under Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is going to launch a bayonet charge right down the hillside there. It's a pretty steep hill, but they're gonna throw them back, and they're gonna hold the line right over here. There's a whole, I can do entire videos on just what happened there. And up on the northern part of the line right here, that's actually at Culp's Hill, where the exact same thing would happen. However, the guy who wrote the report didn't have the same language. The guy, Chamberlain, was an incredibly educated individual, and he knew how to write, and his reports are very poetic, very well, it's well done, well versed. And the guy who was up at Culp's Hill did pretty much the same thing. Bayonet charge, the whole deal, threw back the Confederates. Didn't have the same poetic, way of writing a report, so he became less famous. Also, then you have the movie Gettysburg, which further cemented the 20th Maine in popular history.
Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the
Culp's Hill, same thing happened, right up here.
final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time, it was the Union's turn to unleash.
Okay, bit of thing here. First off, it wasn't Pickett's charge. It was actually Pickett and Pettigrew, and I think Trimble's brigade was involved as well. But basically, it wasn't Pickett's charge. Just sounds better. It's actually Pickett, Pettigrew, possibly Trimble. I'm not sure. Any case, very similar to what happened at Fredericksburg. It's a sloping ground, not quite as slope, but it is a sloping ground uphill against fixed Union positions. Now, the thing is, Longstreet, who was the corps commander in that section, like I said before, he, competent commander, he did not want to be there. He did not think this was a good idea and urged Lincoln, not Lincoln, what am I saying? He urged Lee, don't attack. They have the high ground. What we can do is we can pull back to the high ground of our choice, and then they have to come after us because we're in Northern Territory. They will have to follow, and then they'll be fighting on ground of our choosing. Lee said, no, the enemy is there, and we're going to beat them there, right in the center. Again, we hit them on the flanks. The flanks held, so that means they must be weak in the center. So thing is, Longstreet was ordered to send this attack in, send in Pickett's and Pettigrew's divisions in, and he didn't want to be there, and he kept delaying. He didn't. The artillery bombardment, which actually was the largest artillery bombardment in North American history, 150 pieces opened up around noon. It would probably have been better if he started earlier and kept going. If he had just started earlier, but basically he kept delaying because he thought that maybe Lee will change his mind. And when it became clear he wasn't, then they opened up this barrage, and then about 1 o'clock, the first brigade stepped off. The Union basically was actually relatively safe from this bombardment because it was uphill, so the Confederates are oftentimes overshooting. And I told you I was going to nerd out here. And the Union, there was actually a Union battery commander. Hancock was the corps commander at the time. The battery commander, whose name I don't remember, but he realized they're going to be sending infantry up here. So what I want you to do is, okay, all of our guns that are shooting back, okay, like this gun here, okay, you guys stop shooting and pull back. Okay, then this gun over here, okay, you stop shooting and pull back. And one by one, these Union guns would fall silent and pull back out of the way. The idea was, the Confederates now thought, oh, we're taking out they're not shooting at us as much. Our attack is having some effect. Wow, okay, this is obviously working. Well, no, they were just preparing themselves for the inevitable infantry attack. So when the infantry stepped out of the tree line and started making their way up the hill, the Union rolled their cannons back into position, and they lit up the Confederate forces. They just tore right through them. And so most of the Confederate forces were pretty badly mauled by the time they got to the Union line there, especially at the Bloody Angle. So, which is like, there was a stone wall, and then go like a right angle and a right angle. Right at that point, it was just an absolute chaotic charnel house. It was brutal. Told you I was gonna nerd out.
Unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never...
Yeah, and Pickett actually, who was his unit, his division, spearheaded the attack, was completely in tears. And I think it was he went past Longstreet, and Longstreet, maybe it was Lee, I don't remember exactly. He was asked, like, where is your division? You must see to your division. And he was like, tears were streaming down his face. Sir, I have no division. So yeah, it was just a complete disaster. And actually, a lot of the Union soldiers who were veterans of what happened at Fredericksburg were shouting, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg!" It's like, see, now you know what it's like to go uphill against a fixed position. They thought it was like, a little bit of payback for what happened. Still, absolutely a bloody mess. Gonna nerd out a little bit more here. Actually, go to another channel. It's Gettysburg NPS for National Park Service. They have a bunch of videos, lectures about the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can basically see the ranger talks to them on location, pointing out the different things and explaining what happens in much greater detail. I probably know this battle better than any others, so I'm gonna keep my nerding out now to an absolute minimum. But I could do entire series just on this battle here. So. All right.
He ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi,
the residents of Vicksburg actually never celebrated the 4th of July, at least until somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. So for decades and decades, over a century afterwards, the residents of Vicksburg still consider this to be a bad day in their history, and they didn't celebrate. They never celebrated Independence Day, even after the war.
Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga, and ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe even honey. Do you like honey? Me too. Bees are great. And you know what rhymes with honey? Money. Did you know honey can help you save money? Let me explain. Honey is a free browser extension that automatically finds you the best coupon codes when you buy stuff online for free. For example, here I am purchasing 100 pepperoni pizzas because what the heck, I do what I want. With just a click of a button, I've saved $210. Nice. Honey works with over 30,000 websites, including eBay, Target, and Expedia. And it's already found Oversimplified subscribers over $46,000 in savings. It takes just 2 clicks to install. And better yet, it's absolutely, positively, 100% free. Get Honey now and start saving money by clicking on the link in the description below. Joinhoney.com/oversimplified. That's joinhoney.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So thank you. Now where was I? Oh yeah, Vicksburg, 4th of July, and the Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses for those who had given their lives. A new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still could.
I've been to the cemetery. I've been to Gettysburg itself, and honestly, I just want to say, if you ever do have an opportunity to go there, do so. As much as I like to complain about the government, the National Park Service does an absolutely fantastic job of maintaining it, and they have ranger talks and other programs there. So if you do have a chance to get to Gettysburg, please, by all means, do so.
Couldn't find a decisive victory in the East, and that was bad news for Lincoln because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at victory may.
Is that a K-pop? That's got to be a K-pop band. I don't know who they are, but they look like a K-pop band.
Maybe in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby doing.
Forrest would go on to later found the KKK. Make of that whatever you will. But basically at this point, Grant was taking full advantage of the North's overwhelming economic and numerical superiority, and he just thought, okay, we're just going to be a sledgehammer. We're just going to smash everybody, everywhere, all at the same time, and we're not going to go for like these precise like dagger strikes, try to capture Richmond or to do anything. No, we're going to smash everything. And Sherman's about to go on his famous march to the sea, tearing apart Georgia, and it's just, basically it's like we're gonna make the South suffer.
His best to threaten Sherman's advance, but in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new he did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North.
Yeah, the Wilderness Campaign here was they were complete disasters for the Union. But basically, this is where Grant would start crying. I don't know if he started here, but definitely he was crying in his tent because of the bodies that were stacking up because of his actions. Like, there's the enemy. Go straight at them. We have the numbers, and yes, we might be losing more than them, but we can afford it. They can't. So basically, he just turned the entire war into a giant meat grinder, war of attrition, and just grind them down. Like, think Death Corps of Krieg. This is pretty much it.
As much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. In D.C., Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C. with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical
McClellan.
1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back. That's right. General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln. My fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war. Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get.
Need a change of scenery? Kayak. Search one and done.
I'm not going anywhere. University. Yeah, come on.
Challenge the past.
Okay.
Challenge accepted.
There it goes.
Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide, with the troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. How?
Thing is, before Lincoln was assassinated, Lincoln's plan for the South rejoining the Union was like, let's make this as easy as possible. Something like only 10% of the men in the Confederate States that seceded, they had to swear loyalty to the Union. They were just like super easy terms, and let's try to patch things up as much as possible. There was the 13th Amendment. We are going to be banning slavery, but otherwise, let's they are our fellow countrymen, and let's try to bring them back into the fold as peacefully as possible. After his assassination, the Northerners who took over said, like, no, we're going to drop the hammer on you guys. You kind of deserved it. You bunch of douchebags, and this is what you're going to get for it. So yeah, Reconstruction. Lincoln's plan was for Reconstruction to be way, way more lenient and light-handed than it ended up being. So there you go. And this was all exemplified. If you ever read his second inaugural address, it's one of the great speeches in American history, with malice towards none and charity towards all. And read it if you haven't done so. It's in the public domain, people. It's free.
However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification.
Douchebag.
John Wilkes Booth. An actor living in D.C., was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept, that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet.
Okay, as far as Sherman's March to the Sea goes, he just basically it was like basically the 19th century equivalent of carpet bomb. He just destroyed everything. This was right after harvest time, so a lot of the warehouses and like this is a very fertile region, a lot of farms and stuff. And they lived off all that stuff. They just took all that stuff, denied the Confederacy, including the civilian population, use of that food and other supplies while living off it themselves. And they would just burn and destroy everything. When they were talking about the railroads, there was something known as Sherman's neckties. What they did was they took the wooden ties, that the railroad goes under. The tracks go on there. They pile them up and make a giant bonfire. Then they take the metal part, the actual rail. They put them so that the middle is in the middle of this giant fire until it glows red hot. And then they tie them around a tree, and then they twist it around it. And they're known as Sherman's neckties. And basically, it just made these tracks completely useless. It's not like they just like tore it apart and threw it somewhere else, threw it off the side. Okay, we'll bring it back. I mean, like, they made it so that they cannot be repaired. And there's a lot of them still around. The trees live a long time, so there are trees out there with they still have Sherman's neckties on them. And Sherman, even to this day, is a very hated figure in the South, although there is a statue of him in Atlanta. So yeah, there you go. Oh, and then he will proceed to go up north and do the exact same thing to the Carolinas. But he said famously, "I will make Georgia howl." He did not say anything as poignant or witty about the Carolinas, so nobody really talks about that, but he would do the same thing there. Also, at the same time, way up north, Philip Sheridan would be doing the same thing in the Shenandoah Valley. So, yeah, basically, this was like a basically, the war started as... You'll see, actually, this is like... Civil War is a nice precursor, and... it's kind of like a nice median. At the beginning of the war, everybody was using Napoleonic tactics, it's sort of like that. And then at the end of the war, they're doing battles of attrition. There would be trench warfare, the siege of Petersburg that they were talking about here. We're talking very extensive trench works. Like I've seen photos of them where this looks like, if you take away the uniforms and just look at the works that they have, like the defenses they had set up, this is World War I stuff. This is Western Front stuff. So this is a nice bridge between Napoleonic warfare and World War I. So it's kind of like, it started one way and it ended up in the other. So this is a very, very... The conflict evolved very quickly. Let's put it that way. So there you go.
Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days.
Okay, small issue I had to deal with. Don't worry, I dealt with it. Came back here. I'm going to going back 10 seconds and continuing. Okay, here we go. Continuing.
South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came.
Yeah, the Battle of the Crater was a way to hope to... Okay, yeah, how do I put this? The Battle of the Crater was an attempt to break through the defenses of this position. I'm trying to get back into the mindset. I was in a flow and I got interrupted. In any case, the idea was you would dig a mine underneath the trenches. Actually, a bunch of Pennsylvania guys who were coal miners. They're like, yeah, we know how to dig holes really well. So we dug underneath the Confederate defenses, packed the thing with gunpowder, and then, boom, try to set it off. And the idea was we're going to send troops into this massive breach. Thing is, though, there was actually a black unit that was sent to be the spearhead for this. And they were instructed, and they actually trained, go around the crater. They actually trained to do this. And they, at the last minute, they were pulled out because they thought if this didn't work, it'll be seen as bad for us, that we're basically sending in black units as expendable troops, and it would look bad that we're just like we were carelessly throwing them away. So a white unit was put in to basically try to storm this breach in the line. But they weren't told to go around the crater. They didn't train for it, so they went into the crater. And they went down the crater very easily. Trying to get back up the crater, well, it didn't really work out so well because, well, try going up this giant crater of, stuff like the loose grounds, the gravel and everything. It's like falling on them. They couldn't get up, and they were basically trapped there. And then the Confederates were just like standing on the outside once they recovered from this gigantic blast that happened. The actual thing went without a hitch. That worked out really well. But they were basically, once they recovered, they were standing around seeing these Union troops trying to scramble out of this crater. It's like, this is an easy target. Everybody, light them up. And they were just absolutely decimated. The whole thing was just a complete and utter disaster. It didn't help, too, that the commander of that particular unit was back behind the lines, completely flat out drunk. Didn't help things.
Quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left,
he actually tried to disguise himself wearing women's clothing, and that when he was eventually captured wearing women's clothing, there was no end to the propaganda value of that. Oh yes, it was beautiful.
Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burned out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub, I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha! No!
Yeah, okay, the two of them, placed right next to each other. There's actually a famous painting of them, two of them sitting at the same table. In actual effect, I mean, that's the popular image. In actual effect, they were actually on separate tables, a couple feet apart from each other. They did meet. Lee was in his best clothes. He was completely, as clean as you can be, given that he was in the field. But he was like, his best clothes, very well presented, very well groomed. Grant just kind of showed up with whatever he happened to be wearing at the day. It got mud splattered on it. It hadn't been cleaned in God knows how long. And the two of them, they did meet. They did meet to face. They exchanged a few words. I think they were saying that like they kind of were vaguely aware of each other. They hadn't really met before. They were sort of like operating in the same theater during the Mexican-American War. They were like near each other, and they knew of each other. Even back then, going 20 years or so, but they never actually formally met before. This is the first time the two of them, really met. Then they did like some small talk for a little while. Then they signed the agreement. And again, it wasn't at the same table. They're actually on two separate tables from each other. Just that there's a famous painting depicting them together. So, but that is a bit. This you see here is I know, yes, it's a cartoon, but the image is a bit of a myth.
Not now.
And I don't think anybody was vacuuming at the time, but whatever.
Oh, I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and the commander who formally accepted the surrender, yes, Grant was there, signing the paperwork and all that stuff, but the Union officer who actually took the official Confederate surrender was Brigadier General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the former commander of the 20th Maine. He had been promoted to Brigadier General, had been wounded actually in the pelvis. And it's something that would bother him for the rest of his life. But he was the first official, he took the official surrender of Confederate forces. Also, he had his men salute the Confederates as they were surrendering. Again, this idea that, look, we have fought this very devastating war, but we are fellow countrymen, and let's show some respect to. They're not our enemies anymore. They are our countrymen, and let's try to patch this up as amicably as possible.
General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and
Yeah, and just the thing, while Sherman was marching through Georgia and later on the Carolinas, he was basically continually attacked by Johnston, and Johnston really couldn't do much. I mean, Sherman had such overwhelming numbers on him. It was really just more of an annoyance than anything else. But the two actually did develop a respect for one another, and Johnston was actually a pallbearer at Sherman's funeral. So, yeah. Sherman, I didn't really go into too much into Sherman's personality. The guy was... the guy had, I guess you can say he was had serious depression. I don't know if he was manic depressive, but possibly bipolar. The guy would go into fits of just absolute depression and was completely just not in a good mental state. Him and Grant, though, were very good friends. I did allude to that a bit earlier. And he said that I stood by Grant when he was a drunk, and he stood by me when I was crazy. So the two were very good friends as well, Grant and Sherman. And Sherman later on would become the general-in-chief of the Union of the Federal Army when Grant was president. So long distinguished career ahead for him.
celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him. He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, "I think I am the tiredest man on earth." I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise. The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered.
Okay, this was actually part of a larger conspiracy. It's not something that Wilkes Booth just, arbitrarily thought to do. It was part of a larger conspiracy. Actually, the idea was to decapitate the American government. There was an attack against the Secretary of State. There was an attack on Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president, and other members of cabinet at this point. And they all failed. One of the conspirators got cold feet and wanted nothing to do with it. Another one, I think it was Stanton, a guy who tried to kill Stanton, who was the Secretary of State. I think it was Stanton, yeah. It's a political thing. I'm not really sure about that guy. But in any case, his assassin tried to stab him in the neck, but he had an injury before, so he had this metal collar around his neck. So it bounced off this metal collar, and he was managed to survive because of that. And the whole thing was just the only successful assassin was John Wilkes Booth, who broke his leg, and there was a big manhunt for him. He jumped off that balcony onto the stage below, broke his leg right there, yelling the word "Sic Semper Tyrannis," thus always for tyrants, which is the motto of the state of Virginia, where he was from, and and then bolted off the stage. And it actually took people a few seconds, like, not to realize, wait, this isn't part of the production. Like, what's going on here? And eventually he would be hunted down and executed in a barn. And by executed, he actually was executed in a barn. There were orders to take him alive, but basically the thing was burnt down, and the Union troops that were around were more than happy to say, "Oh, he's coming right for us!" Bang, and they just lit him up right there rather than taking him in alive, because the guy was a douchebag.
A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The Southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, but the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as
Reconstruction, it's like I said before, Lincoln wanted to make things as even-handed as possible, and after his assassination, people in charge said, "No, we're gonna bring the hammer down," and actually bred a tremendous amount of resentment amongst the Southerners. I actually can't say I blame them, though. I think Lincoln was a little too lenient, but then again, who knows how things would have turned out? I mean, that's alternate history. Who knows? But Reconstruction. There was corruption. The whole thing was just a disaster. It could have been handled a lot better. I think Lincoln would have been too lenient, but things were way too harsh as well. Who knows how things could have been? But yeah, I'm not too familiar with Reconstruction, but there you go.
a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
And I think that's it. Yeah. And I think that's it, yeah. Yeah, that's it. And of course there's an ad. Let me just go back. Whatever. Anyway, so yeah, that's it for that. The Civil War was easily the most devastating conflict in American history. I'm more familiar with the military stuff than the political stuff, of course. But a lot of fun with this one. I really did enjoy Oversimplified. They always do fantastic work. And that's pretty much it. So I think I've rambled enough about this. I've wasted enough of your guys' time. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos will be coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a good day. Or don't have a good day. Your adults have any kind of day you want. See you later.